The night was so still that even the rustling of dry leaves felt like an intrusion into some forbidden quiet. I had been sitting in my car, parked just a block away from the abandoned Ravenwood factory, watching the dark silhouette of the crumbling structure loom against the starless sky. It had been a week since the video surfaced. Grainy footage of 4 young thrill-seekers exploring the factory before vanishing without a trace. The last frame had burned itself into my mind. A single flashlight spinning wildly before plunging into darkness. I didn't believe in curses or haunted places. At least, that's what I told myself as I pulled my jacket tighter against the chill and approached the rusted gates. The locals had their stories, of course. A factory fire in the 1970s. Dozens of workers trapped inside, their screams carried on the wind for days after the flames had died. But that was just history, or so I thought. The gate groaned in protest. As I pushed it open, the sound slicing through the quiet like a scream. Every instinct told me to turn back, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pulled me forward. My flashlight illuminated the cracked pavement, the weeds clawing their way through the decay, and the shattered remnants of a once thriving industry. As I reached the main entrance, I saw it. A faint trail of something smeared across the floor. It could have been oil, but the color, too dark, too thick, made my stomach tighten. I followed it, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the walls, until I reached a set of heavy double doors hanging ajar. Beyond them, the air grew colder, thicker, as though the factory itself was breathing in the night. The beam of my flashlight swept across the cavernous space. Machinery stood like skeletal remains, rusted and broken, their purpose long forgotten. And then I saw it. A camera tripod toppled over near a puddle of what looked like stagnant water. It was the same one from the video. The air shifted, carrying with it a low, guttural sound, like a growl dragged out of the deepest parts of the earth. My breath caught as I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was the wind, a stray animal, anything but what my gut was telling me. But then I saw movement. Something in the corner of my eye, quick and darting, too fast to be human. I should have left. Every muscle in my body begged me to run, but I couldn't. Instead, I followed the sound, deeper into the labyrinth of steel and shadow, my flashlight flickering as if protesting my choices. The trail of dark liquid led me to a staircase, spiraling downward into the bowels of the factory. The temperature dropped with each step, the air growing heavy with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic. Blood. No. It had to be something else. At the bottom, the darkness seemed alive, pressing against me, swallowing the beam of my flashlight. My fingers brushed against a door frame, and I pushed it open, revealing a small room cluttered with old papers, jars of strange substances, and photographs pinned to the walls. My heart raced as I stepped closer. The faces in the photos were distorted, their eyes blacked out, their mouths twisted in silent screams. One of the jars tipped over as I brushed past, its contents spilling across the floor. you doing? It looked like ash, but it moved, crawling toward me, as though drawn by some invisible force. The sound came again, louder, closer. A scraping, dragging noise that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. The flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into absolute darkness. Panic surged as I fumbled for my phone. Its screen casting a dim light, just enough to see the reflection of eyes in the glass jars, glinting with malevolent intelligence. I staggered back, tripping over something soft and yielding. And my phone's light swept across the floor, revealing what it was: a shoe, partially melted and stained with the same dark substance I had been following. The air turned suffocating, thick with the weight of something unseen, pressing down on my chest. Then a whisper, soft and sibilant, curling around my ears like smoke. You shouldn't have come here. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was alone in the pitch-black room, the whispers growing louder, angrier, and impossibly close. The whispers became unbearable, weaving through the darkness like venom-laced threads. Each word, if they were even words, scratched at the edges of my sanity. My hands trembled as I clutched the useless flashlight. Now nothing more than dead weight. I needed to move. I, standing, still felt like surrendering to whatever was lurking just beyond my sight. The floor beneath me was cold and uneven. As I groped forward, my phone's dim light flickering weakly, it barely pierced the oppressive darkness. But it was all I had. The air smelled wrong, thick and rancid, like decay mixed with something sharper, something almost metallic. My foot kicked something, and the hollow clatter echoed loudly. It sounded like a tool, maybe a wrench, but I didn't stop to confirm. Then came the sound again, the dragging, scraping noise that seemed to originate from all directions. It was closer now, so close that I could feel it reverberate in my chest. My breath quickened, coming out in shallow gasps that sounded too loud, too exposed. I turned sharply, aiming the faint glow of my phone's light toward the noise. But the space remained suffocatingly empty. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, the weight of unseen eyes boring into me. I stumbled into a corridor I hadn't noticed before, its walls narrowing as though the factory itself was closing in on me. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping with condensation that formed dark streaks on the floor. The whispers faded, replaced by a low hum that set my teeth on edge. I followed the corridor, drawn forward despite the screaming protests of every instinct I had. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my skull, and I realized it wasn't mechanical. It was alive, a pulsing sound that seemed to come from within the walls. My phone's battery was dying, the light dimming with each passing second, but I could make out a door at the end of the hallway. It was old, its wood swollen and cracked, but something about it felt deliberate, as though it didn't belong in this decaying factory. Pushing it open revealed a room that didn't fit with the rest of the building. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding jars filled with murky liquid. Inside floated objects I couldn't, and didn't want to, identify. The floor was marked with strange symbols, carved deep into the concrete, and filled with a dark, dried substance. My eyes were drawn to a table in the center of the room, its surface covered with more of the jars, papers scrawled with unintelligible writing, and a single photograph. I picked it up hesitantly, my stomach twisting as I recognized the faces from the video. The 4 missing kids. They were standing in front of the factory, their expressions forced and uneasy. Something about the photo felt wrong, like it was watching me as much as I was looking at it. Then I noticed the shadow in the background, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't human. A crash shattered the oppressive silence, and I spun around, nearly dropping the photograph. Build you. One of the jars had fallen from the shelf, its contents spilling across the floor in a slick, dark puddle. But it wasn't liquid. It was moving, writhing like a living thing. I backed away, my heart pounding as the puddle began to coalesce, forming a shape that defied comprehension. The humming grew deafening, a relentless vibration that made my vision blur. My phone flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. The room felt alive, the air shifting as though something massive was breathing in tandem with my panicked gasps. I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely find the handle. When I finally wrenched it open, the hallway beyond was no longer the same. The walls seemed to pulse, the pipes dripping with something thicker than water. The hum followed me as I stumbled forward, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the walls to keep myself steady. The factory was changing, twisting into something unnatural, something designed to trap me. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping until they formed a single guttural voice. You can't leave. I ran, the words echoing in my ears, reverberating in my skull like a curse. My lungs burned, my legs screaming with each frantic step. But the hallway stretched endlessly, as though I was running in place. I could feel it behind me. The presence I'd only glimpsed in shadows and reflections. It was no longer hiding. It wanted me to know it was there. My foot caught on something, and I hit the ground hard, the impact rattling my bones. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. I clawed at the ground, dragging myself forward as the voice grew louder, angrier. The faint glow of an exit sign appeared in the distance, its light flickering like a dying ember. I crawled toward it, each movement a battle against the suffocating force that seemed determined to keep me there. When I finally reached the door, I shoved it open with the last of my strength, collapsing onto the cold, damp ground outside. The night air hit me like a wave, sharp and biting. But it was real. I was outside. The factory loomed behind me, silent and still, as though mocking my escape. But as I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized the whispers hadn't stopped. The whispers clung to me, seeping into my thoughts, as if they had burrowed beneath my skin. The cool night air should have been a relief, but it felt wrong, heavy with the weight of something unnatural. I sat on the cracked pavement outside the factory, trying to steady my breath. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize what I had seen, what I had heard, there was no explanation that fit. I forced myself to my feet, my legs weak beneath me. The factory loomed behind me, dark and silent, its broken windows glinting faintly in the moonlight like jagged teeth. Every instinct told me to leave, to drive as far away from this cursed place as possible. But something held me there. It wasn't curiosity this time. It was dread. I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't done with this place, that it had let me go only because it wasn't finished with me yet. I stumbled back toward my car, the faint glow of the headlights, a distant beacon in the darkness. As I reached it, I noticed a figure standing a few yards away, shrouded in shadows. My heart lurched into my throat, but as I stepped closer, I saw it was an old man. He was hunched, leaning heavily on a cane, his face obscured by the brim of a battered hat. His presence was so sudden, so out of place, that I froze. "You've seen it now," he rasped, his voice brittle and dry like old leaves. "You shouldn't have gone in there." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What is it?" The words felt hollow, inadequate. He lifted his head slightly, just enough for me to see his eyes, clouded, as though they had seen too much. "Not something you can fight, not something you can run from." His grip tightened on the cane, his knuckles white. "The factory keeps what it takes. You escaped, but it won't let you go." His words hit me like a blow, the weight of their meaning sinking into my chest. "I don't understand," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to. "What does it want?" "It doesn't want," he said, his voice trembling now. "It is a hunger, a shadow that feeds on those foolish enough to step into its grasp." I wanted to dismiss him, to write him off as another superstitious local with a flair for the dramatic. But the fear in his eyes mirrored my own, and that terrified me more than anything. He glanced at the factory, his expression tightening. "You've brought something out with you. It won't stop." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. The air around me felt colder now, sharper, as though the factory's presence was bleeding into the world beyond its walls. I climbed into my car, locking the doors out of instinct, even though it felt futile. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the empty road, the factory shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. But the whispers followed me, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like a distant echo. When I reached the motel where I was staying, I bolted the door behind me and turned on every light. The room felt suffocatingly small, the shadows in the corners too deep, too still. My reflection in the mirror above the sink looked pale and drawn, my eyes hollow. I splashed cold water on my face, but it didn't help. The whispers were louder now, insistent, pulling at my thoughts like threads unraveling a tapestry. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door as though something might burst through it at any moment. Sleep was impossible, but exhaustion was dragging me down, blurring the edges of my vision. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but the dreams came almost immediately. Dark, chaotic fragments of the factory, of faces twisted in agony, of shadows that moved like living things. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, the whispers now so loud that I couldn't tell if they were in my head or in the room. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. A notification. A video had been sent to me from an unknown number. With trembling hands, I opened it. The footage was shaky, disjointed, but I recognized the setting immediately. The factory. The camera moved through the hallways I had stumbled through, the hum and whispers audible even through the tinny speakers of my phone. But then it turned, and the perspective changed. It was me. I was in the frame, crawling toward the exit, my face contorted in terror. The camera lingered on my retreating form before panning back to the darkness, where two pinpricks of light, eyes, watched silently. The screen went black, and for a moment, so did the room. And so did the room. The lights flickered, the air grew heavy, and a single whisper, clearer than all the others, curled around me like smoke. You brought it with you. The air in the motel room felt stifling, as if the walls had crept closer while I wasn't looking. The faint hum of the fluorescent light buzzed unevenly above me, adding to the oppressive tension that had settled deep in my chest. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, but I could still feel its weight. Its screen burned into my memory. The video wasn't just a warning. It was proof. Whatever was happening, it wasn't bound to the factory anymore. I stood and paced the room, running my hands through my hair as my thoughts spiraled. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the video was a cruel joke, something fabricated to prey on my already fragile state. But who would have sent it, and how could they have known about the eyes? Edain, a tuti. The memory of those glowing points of light sent a shiver down my spine. The room felt wrong, too quiet, despite the buzz of the light. My gaze flicked to the shadows pooling in the corners. Aim too far, but too fright. They didn't move, but they felt alive, watching, waiting. I grabbed the chair from the small desk and wedged it under the door handle. A futile attempt at control. I needed answers. The old man's words echoed in my mind. Here's that lie. You've brought something out with you. He had to know more. Something that could help me make sense of this. But how could I find him? He'd vanished into the night like a ghost, leaving nothing but his cryptic warning. My laptop sat on the desk, its screen glowing faintly in the dim room. I opened it, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The factory's name was my only lead. A quick search brought up articles, most of them about the fire, decades ago. The photos of the charred ruins were familiar, but one caught my eye, a black and white image of the factory in its prime. Workers stood outside, their expressions somber, and behind them was the faint outline of something scratched into the bricks. A symbol. Fee. It looked like the ones I'd seen carved into the floor of that room. Crude and angular, almost like a warning. I leaned closer, studying the image until my vision blurred. The symbol tugged at something in my memory, something I couldn't quite grasp. I searched further, digging through every scrap of information I could find. Mentions of missing workers, rumors of strange occurrences, but nothing concrete. Then, buried in an old forum post, I found it. A name. Dr. Elias Kern Tonks. The post described him as the lead scientist for a project tied to the factory before the fire. The details were vague, but the writer claimed Kern had been experimenting with ways to harness energy from unknown sources. My stomach churned as I read the words. Ensubi and cocktail. It sounded like pseudoscience, but after what I'd experienced, I wasn't so sure. The post also mentioned that Kern had disappeared after the fire, though some believed he'd gone into hiding. I kept digging, piecing together scraps of information, until I found a more recent thread. A user claimed to have met Kern years ago, living under a different name in a small town, just 2 hours away. My fingers trembled as I scribbled down the address. I didn't know if he was still there, or if he was even alive, but it was my only lead. I shut the laptop and grabbed my keys, the chair under the door handle creaking as I moved it aside. Stepping outside, I was hit with the weight of the night air, thick and clinging. The parking lot was empty, the motel shrouded in a silence that felt unnatural. My car sat under a flickering street lamp, its edges blurred by the dim light. The drive was suffocating, the darkness pressing against my windows like a living thing. The road stretched endlessly, the headlights carving a narrow path through the void. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more times than I could count. Each glance met with an empty backseat, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The town was little more than a cluster of houses and a single gas station, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the distance. I found the address easily. An old, weathered house on the edge of the woods. The windows were dark, the air around it unnaturally still. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The house loomed above me, its silhouette jagged and uninviting. My hand hovered over the doorbell before I forced myself to press it. The chime echoed hollowly inside, followed by silence. I was about to turn away when the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked as though he'd been carved from stone. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his hands gripped the edge of the doorframe like he needed the support. "Are you Kern?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to steady it. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Envelop. You've seen it," he said flatly. his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived too long with the truth. He stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. The inside of the house was a mess, papers and books piled haphazardly, the air thick with the scent of mildew and dust. He led me to a small room in the back, its walls covered in diagrams and symbols that mirrored the ones I'd seen at the factory. "It's not just the factory," he said, his voice low. "It's a doorway. Something we never should have opened." I swallowed hard, the gravity of his words sinking in. "What is it?" I asked. He met my eyes, his gaze hollow and haunted. "It's older than us, older than this world. And once it sees you, it doesn't stop." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and the whispers began again, louder now, as though they had found me. Cairn's face twisted with fear as he turned toward the doorway. "It's here," he whispered. The air in Cairn's house shifted, thickening with a weight I couldn't explain. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the fear in Cairn's eyes rooted me in place. His trembling hand gripped the edge of the desk, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The flickering light above us cast jagged shadows on the walls, making the symbols seem to writhe and twist like living things. "It's not just watching anymore," Cairn said, his voice low and uneven. "It's coming through." I didn't know what he meant, but the words made my chest tighten. The whispers started again, curling around the room like smoke. They were louder now, more distinct, as if they were building towards something. Cairn moved to a corner of the room and yanked open a drawer, scattering papers and objects onto the floor. He pulled out a small metal box, its surface etched with symbols similar to the ones on the walls. "This," he said, shoving it toward me. "You'll need it. It's the only thing I managed to salvage after the fire. It won't stop it, but it can slow it down." I stared at the box, unsure whether to take it. "What is this thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Cairn's gaze darkened. "A mistake. We thought we were studying energy, something we could harness, but we were wrong. It's not energy. It's alive." Before I could process what he was saying, a deafening crack echoed through the house, like a thunderclap inside my skull. The lights went out, plunging us into darkness so complete it felt like a physical force. My phone's screen lit up instinctively, but the faint glow only seemed to deepen the shadows. Cairn cursed under his breath. It's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We're out of time." I barely had a chance to react before the whispers erupted into a cacophony, a chorus of overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls groaned as if the house itself was straining against an unseen force. My phone's light flickered, and in that momentary strobe I saw them, shadows that didn't belong, shapes that moved with impossible fluidity. Cairn grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Stay close," he hissed. "If you lose sight of me, you won't make it out." He pulled me toward the door, but the hallway had changed. The walls seemed to pulse, narrowing and shifting as if the house was alive, reshaping itself to trap us. The floor beneath my feet felt unsteady, like it was barely there at all. A sudden burst of cold air hit me, stealing the breath from my lungs. I turned, my phone's light sweeping across the room behind us. For a split second, I saw it, an enormous, formless shadow, darker than the absence of light, stretching and writhing as if it were testing the limits of its reach. Its edges bled into the walls, merging with the darkness, and at its center were two faint, glowing pinpricks that pierced through the void. Cairn yanked me forward, snapping me out of my paralysis. Evening, don't lie, the doll could be. Don't look at it, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. We stumbled through the twisting corridors, the house shifting around us with every step. Doors appeared where there had been none, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. One opened to a void so vast, it felt like standing at the edge of the universe. Another revealed a flickering image of the factory, the shadows within it moving in unnatural patterns. Each step felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening, dragging us down. Cairn's breathing was ragged as we finally reached what looked like the front door. Huh! He fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. No, he muttered, panic creeping into his voice. It's not supposed to be like this. Behind us, the whispers surged, growing into a low, guttural roar. I turned in time to see the shadows pouring down the hallway, their movements chaotic and hungry. Cairn pulled something from his pocket, a small, rusted key, and jammed it into the lock. The door gave way, and we stumbled outside, collapsing onto the cold, damp ground. For a moment, the night was still. The house stood behind us, silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. Cairn sat beside me, his head in his hands, his breaths shallow and uneven. "It's not done," he said finally, his voice a hollow whisper. "It never is." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The edges of my vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I saw the shadows again, flickering just beyond the tree line. But when I blinked, they were gone. Cairn stood unsteadily, his movements slow and deliberate. "You have to understand," he said, looking at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's in you now, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." I opened my mouth to ask what that meant, but a low rumble from the house silenced me. The walls seemed to shift, the entire structure tilting slightly, as though it were alive and aware of us standing there. Cairn grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "We need to move," he said, his voice sharp and urgent. "It's waking up." The forest swallowed us whole, its dense shadows pressing against my skin like a second layer. "Only," Cairn moved ahead of me, his strides uneven but purposeful, his silhouette barely visible in the faint moonlight, filtering through the twisted branches above. Every step felt heavier, the air thicker, with an unnatural weight that made my lungs ache. Behind us, The house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that felt alive. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The memory of its shifting walls and the shadows that crawled through them was enough to keep me moving, even as exhaustion gnawed at my legs and the whispers started to creep back into my mind. "They can't follow us here," Kern muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting, as if he expected the shadows to emerge from the trees. At any moment. "Not yet. Not yet," I hissed, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound steady. "What does that mean?" Cairn didn't answer. He pressed on, his hand gripping the small metal box had given me earlier, as if it were a lifeline. I clutched it tightly, its edges digging into my palm. It felt cold, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in ice. The forest grew darker, the moonlight fading as the canopy thickened above us. The ground became uneven, roots and rocks tripping me at every step. The whispers, faint at first, began to grow louder, threading through the trees like a ghostly wind. I couldn't make out the words, if they even were words, but they carried a weight, a sense of inevitability that made my stomach churn. Cairn stopped suddenly, his hand shooting up to signal me to stay quiet. I froze, my breath hitching, as I strained to hear what had caught his attention. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that felt more threatening than the noise. "They're testing us," Kern said quietly, his voice barely audible. "It wants to see if we'll turn back." I didn't ask what it was. I already knew, or at least I thought I did. The formless shadow that had followed me from the factory, the thing that had twisted the house into something alive. It was the source of all of this. But what Kern didn't seem to understand was that I wasn't just being followed. It was inside me now, clawing at the edges of my mind, waiting for something. The silence shattered with a sound like breaking glass, sharp and sudden. I stumbled back, clutching the box as the trees around us seemed to shudder. Cairn grabbed my arm, his grip almost painfully tight. "Run," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't stop, no matter what you see." He didn't wait for me to respond. He took off, his movements frantic but deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he was going. I hesitated for a split second before following, my legs burning as I pushed myself to keep up. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding us in a chaotic symphony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and warping in my peripheral vision. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, something massive and cold, moving just beyond my sight. Ahead of me, Kern veered sharply to the left, disappearing behind a thick cluster of trees. I followed, nearly losing my footing as the ground sloped downward into a narrow ravine. The whispers grew sharper, more distinct, and for the first time, I thought I could make out a word. "Stay." It was a single command, spoken with a weight that made my knees buckle. I stumbled, falling hard onto the damp earth. Unsettling. The box slipped from my grasp, landing a few feet away. My vision swam as the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches stretching and twisting into shapes that didn't belong. I reached for the box, my fingers brushing against its cold surface, just as Kern appeared, grabbing my arm and yanking me to my feet. "Don't listen," he shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. The ground beneath us began to shift, the soil rippling like water. The shadows around us deepened, coalescing into forms that were almost human, but not quite. Their faces were wrong, their features distorted and incomplete, like reflections in shattered glass. Cairn shoved me forward, his voice urgent. "Keep moving, we're close." I didn't know what he meant by close, but I didn't have time to ask. The shadows moved toward us, their limbs stretching unnaturally as they reached out. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and a wave of nausea surged through me, almost dropping me to my knees. Cairn pulled me up the other side of the ravine, his breath ragged and uneven. Ahead of us, a faint light flickered in the distance. A small, dilapidated cabin, its windows glowing with a dim, flickering light. "In there," Cairn said, his voice hoarse. "It's the only place they can't reach." The words barely registered as I stumbled toward the cabin, my legs threatening to give out with every step. The whispers were deafening now, a wall of sound that pressed against my skull. The shadows were closer, their movements more erratic, their distorted faces twisted with something that might have been anger or hunger. Cairn reached the cabin first, throwing the door open and motioning for me to follow. "Emtinalai and AC." I collapsed inside, the air thick with the scent of smoke and damp wood. Cairn slammed the door shut behind us, bolting it with a rusted latch. For a moment, the only sound was our labored breathing. Then, slowly, the whispers began to fade, replaced by the faint crackle of a dying fire. In the corner of the room, Cairn sank to the floor, his back against the wall. He looked at me, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "We don't have much time," he said. "It knows we're here." "Endless pandemonium. It download sign." The cabin's walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each beat of my racing heart. The flickering firelight cast shifting shadows that danced across the warped wooden beams, their movements too fluid, too deliberate, as if mocking our fragile sense of safety. Cairn sat slumped against the wall, his hand shaking as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. His eyes, hollow and bloodshot, darted toward me. "It's not just a place," he said, his voice a rasp, barely audible over the faint crackle of the fire. "It's alive. It sees us. It learns from us." The weight of his words settled over me, suffocating and undeniable. I looked down at the small metal box in my hands, its cold surface now slick with sweat. "What does it want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Cairn didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the paper, his fingers tracing the symbols etched into its surface. "It doesn't want anything," he said. "It is. It consumes. It corrupts. And it doesn't stop until there's nothing left." A sudden sharp creak echoed through the cabin, the sound like a branch snapping under the weight of something massive. I whipped my head toward the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shadows outside had deepened, pooling unnaturally against the edges of the windows. Something was moving out there, slow and deliberate, its form too large and undefined to comprehend. Cairn stood abruptly, his movements jerky, frantic. "It's testing us," he muttered, "seeing how far it can go before we break." I swallowed hard, my throat dry and raw. How do we stop it? The question felt hollow, almost laughable, but it spilled out before I could stop myself. Cairn turned to me, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and despair. "You can't stop it. You can only slow it down. Maybe buy yourself a little more time." The air in the cabin shifted again, growing heavier, colder. The fire flickered violently, its flames sputtering as if struggling to stay alive. A low, guttural sound began to seep through the walls, a vibration that I felt in my bones. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it carried the weight of a command. "Come, one fair. The word reverberated through my skull, pulling at something deep inside me. My grip on the box tightened, the edges digging into my palm. Digging into my palm. Cairn stumbled toward the table in the corner, his movements desperate. He grabbed a piece of chalk and began scrawling symbols across the floor, his breathing shallow and uneven. "Stay inside the circle," he said, his voice sharp, commanding. "No matter what happens, don't step out." The cabin groaned, the walls buckling slightly as if something enormous was pressing against them. The shadows outside grew darker, denser, merging into a single, undulating mass. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to look away. The shadows pulsed, and for a brief moment I thought I saw faces within them, twisted, distorted faces, their mouths open in silent screams. Cairn finished the circle and collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he clutched the chalk. "It's not enough," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too strong now." The shadows surged forward, slamming against the walls with a force that shook the entire cabin. The windows cracked, the thin glass spiderwebbing under the pressure. The air was thick with the smell of ash and decay, so strong that it made my stomach turn. Cairn looked up at me, his expression one of resignation. "It's you," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's tied to you now. You're the key." "I don't understand," I shouted, the panic rising in my chest like a tidal wave. "What do you mean?" "You brought it out," Cairn said. "You opened the door. And now It's using you to keep it open. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The factory, the shadows, the whispers. It had all started the moment I stepped inside. I had become its anchor, the thread it needed to spread beyond its walls. The cabin shuddered violently, the walls splintering as the shadows began to seep through the cracks. Ah. Cairn grabbed my arm, his grip ironclad. "You have to destroy the connection," he said. "It's the only way." "What connection?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How?" Cairn pointed to the box in my hands. "Elurus, Amori, Dividai, Dobunko." "That. It's the last piece of the experiment. Destroy it, and you sever the tie." The shadows surged again, slamming into the cabin, with enough force to knock us both to the ground. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic symphony that made it impossible to think. My hands shook as I looked down at the box, its surface cold and unyielding. Cairn's voice cut through the chaos. "Do it before it's too late." I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Destroying the box might sever the connection. But what if it didn't? What if it made things worse? The shadows closed in, their presence suffocating, their movements frenzied. With a deep breath, I raised the box above my head and brought it down against the floor with all the strength I could muster. The metal cracked, a sharp, piercing sound that seemed to ripple through the air. The shadows recoiled, their movements erratic, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost worse. The cabin creaked, the walls settling back into place. "Emudiyota." Cairn lay on the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I dropped the broken remnants of the box, my hands trembling. "It's over," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Cairn looked at me, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, his voice weak. "It's never over. Eni tikanim elabas." The forest was alive in a way that set my nerves on edge. Every rustle of leaves, every faint snap of a twig sounded amplified in the stillness. I adjusted my grip on the flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the suffocating darkness that swallowed everything just a few feet ahead. The others were close, their footsteps crunching softly on the damp ground, but the weight of the night made them feel miles away. We had been hiking for hours, the woods growing denser and more claustrophobic the deeper we ventured. The air smelled damp and earthy, mingled with something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. It clung to the back of my throat, acrid and unnatural, as though the forest itself was warning us to turn back. I glanced down at the GPS tracker, strapped to my wrist. The blinking dot on the screen marked the last known position of the missing campers. 2 college students who had come to Appalachia to find themselves and never return. The local sheriff had written them off as runaways, but their families insisted they weren't the type to vanish without a word. That was why we were here, to find evidence, to map the uncharted wilderness, and if we were lucky, to bring them back. But luck had never been my strong suit. Ahead, the beam of another flashlight swung upward, illuminating a tree whose bark was stripped away in deep, jagged gouges. They were too far apart to be from a bear, and too deliberate to be an accident. My stomach twisted as I knelt to examine the ground beneath it. The soil was disturbed, clawed at as if something or someone had been dragged. A faint, dark stain streaked through the dirt, barely visible but unmistakable. I stood, my pulse quickening as I scanned the forest around us. The trees felt closer now, their towering forms leaning inward like silent sentinels. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint sound that stopped me cold. It was a low, mournful hum, like a voice stretched and distorted, rising and falling in an unnatural cadence. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hand instinctively went to the radio, clipped to my belt. Static crackled in my ear as I tried to call out to the others, but the words caught in my throat. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I felt it reverberate in my chest like the growl of a predator just out of sight. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a shadow darting between the trees. Too fast to be an animal, too silent to be human. My flashlight jerked toward it, but the beam only found empty forest. The others had stopped now, their lights swinging in nervous arcs. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The unease was palpable, spreading through us like a contagion. I stepped forward, my foot catching on something half buried in the underbrush. Looking down, I saw a shoe, mud-caked and torn, its laces frayed. It didn't belong here. I crouched, picking it up carefully, and my stomach churned as I noticed the dark stain along its sole. It was fresh. The hum reached a fever pitch, a droning vibration that made my teeth ache. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying whispers that weren't whispers, sounds that imitated speech without forming words. My heart pounded as I turned to the others, but they were already moving, their faces pale and grim. We followed the trail of disturbed earth and broken branches, the faint streaks of blood leading us deeper into the unknown. The path ended abruptly at a clearing. It was too perfect, too circular, as if the forest had carved it out deliberately. In the center stood a lone structure, a crude arrangement of branches and stones, like a shrine to something ancient and forgotten. Symbols were etched into the stones, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the pale moonlight. I couldn't look at them for more than a few seconds without a sharp pain stabbing behind my eyes. Something was wrong with the air here. It felt heavier, thicker, as though we had stepped into a place that didn't belong to the world we knew. The hum was louder now, pulsing in time with the flickering light of the symbols. One of the others, a grad student named Marla, moved closer to the shrine, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the stones. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the forest erupted. The hum became a roar, a deafening cacophony that drowned out our panicked cries. The ground beneath us shuddered violently, cracks splitting through the earth with a sound like thunder. Shadows poured out of the trees, not moving but crawling, their edges jagged and wrong. They writhed and twisted, their shapes impossible to comprehend, their presence consuming every inch of light. Marla screamed, her voice high and raw, as the shadows reached for her. They moved like liquid smoke, curling around her ankles and dragging her toward the shrine. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm. But it was like trying to hold on to air. The shadows pulled harder, and she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The roar stopped, as suddenly as it had begun. The clearing was silent again, the shadows retreating into the trees, like a tide receding. Marla was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign she had ever been there at all. The shrine remained, its symbols still faintly glowing, as if mocking us. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The others were frozen, their faces pale and blank, their eyes reflecting the same disbelief I felt. The forest around us felt darker now, more alive, its presence pressing against us with an almost sentient malice. I couldn't stop staring at the shrine, its jagged symbols burning into my memory. Whatever this place was, whatever had taken Marla, it wasn't finished with us. The forest had seen us, and now it wouldn't let us go. The clearing felt like a wound in the forest, raw and exposed, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. My legs trembled as I took a step back from the shrine, its jagged symbols still faintly glowing, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. Marla was gone. There was no trace of her, no sound, no movement. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole, erasing her existence in an instant. The others stood frozen, their faces pale and drained of color. One of them, Jackson, muttered something under his breath, his words unintelligible and frantic. I couldn't look at them for long. If I did, I'd see my own fear reflected back, and I wasn't sure I could handle it. The hum returned, softer now, but more insidious, threading through the silence like a warning. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering, as though the batteries were failing. I clenched it tighter, forcing myself to focus on the trail ahead. We had to move. Standing still felt like an invitation for whatever had taken Marla to come back. I forced my voice to steady, though it felt like a stranger's as I spoke. We need to keep going. Staying here isn't safe. No one responded, but they followed as I turned and started back toward the path. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the forest pressing down on me like a physical force. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to pull us back. The air grew colder, the faint scent of damp earth replaced by something acrid and metallic. It wasn't long before we noticed the tracks. Wah. Tugifi. Yes. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. Deep impressions in the soil, spaced too far apart to be human. Too deliberate to be an animal. They carved a path through the underbrush, leading deeper into the forest, their edges jagged and sharp. I crouched beside one, my breath catching as I traced its outline with my flashlight. It was wrong, not just in its size, but in the way it seemed to press into the earth without displacing it, as if it had simply appeared. Jackson knelt beside me, his face pale and slick with sweat. "What the hell made these?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. My eyes drifted back toward the path, the tracks carved, leading into the impenetrable darkness. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest, pulling me forward, even as every instinct screamed for me to turn back. We followed the tracks in silence, our footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The trees grew denser, their branches knitting together overhead to block out what little moonlight remained. My flashlight flickered again, its beam struggling against the shadows that seemed to grow thicker with every step. I glanced back at the others, their faces pale and taut, their eyes darting nervously to the shifting darkness around us. The tracks led us to a clearing, smaller than the first, but just as unsettling. In the center lay a torn backpack, its contents scattered across the ground like the remnants of a struggle. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to one of the missing campers. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, a confirmation of something I wasn't ready to face. I stepped closer, crouching to examine the contents. A flashlight, its lens cracked, a notebook, its pages smeared with something dark. My fingers hesitated before picking it up, the damp paper sticking to my skin. Flipping through the pages, I saw hurried, frantic sketches, trees, symbols, faces twisted in terror. One page caught my eye, the lines darker and more defined. It was the shrine. The words scrawled beneath it were barely legible, but I could make out a single phrase repeated over and over. "It sees us." A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, the notebook falling from my hands. The others had frozen, their eyes wide and fixed on the trees. The hum had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. I strained to listen, to hear whatever they were hearing, but the stillness was absolute. Then, slowly, the forest began to move. The shadows shifted first, pooling at the edges of the clearing like liquid smoke. They rippled and writhed, stretching toward us in tendrils that seemed to defy the light of our flashlights. My heart pounded as I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger, and I realized with a sickening clarity that we were not alone. A low, guttural sound emerged from the darkness, a sound that wasn't a growl, but something far worse, something that sounded almost human. The shadows coalesced, their movements becoming more deliberate, more purposeful. My flashlight's beam caught something in the dark, something that shimmered and shifted like a mirage. It wasn't solid, not fully, but it was there. Watching, Jackson bolted first, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush as he disappeared into the forest. The others followed, their panic erupting into chaos as they scattered in every direction. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my gaze locked on the shifting form in the shadows, before the primal urge to survive took over. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and stretching, as if alive, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. The ground beneath me felt uneven, the roots and rocks conspiring to trip me at every step. The hum returned, louder and more oppressive, resonating in my chest and head, until it was all I could hear. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The shadows followed, their presence a weight on my back, a suffocating reminder that they were faster, stronger. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't dare stop. The forest opened suddenly, spilling me into another clearing. My momentum carried me forward, and I fell to my knees. The impact, jarring but distant compared to the terror coursing through me. I looked back, expecting to see the shadows closing in, but the clearing was empty. The hum had stopped, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. I collapsed onto the damp ground, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The forest was silent again, but the silence was worse than the noise. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be over. The shadows had seen me, and now they wouldn't let me go. The forest was silent now, but it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. This was a predator's silence, the calm before a strike. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my pulse a deafening drumbeat in my ears. The clearing around me was bathed in an unnatural stillness, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stayed on my knees for a moment longer, gripping the damp earth beneath me, as if anchoring myself to reality. My mind replayed the events that had led me here. Marla's disappearance, the shadows, the hum, but they felt distant, blurred by adrenaline and fear. I had lost track of the others in the chaos, their panicked footsteps fading into the forest's depths. I didn't even know if they were still alive. A faint rustle broke the stillness, and my head snapped toward the sound. It was distant, but deliberate, too controlled to be the wind. I scrambled to my feet, my legs trembling as I raised my flashlight. The beam cut through the clearing, its pale light catching on twisted branches and the glint of damp leaves. But there was nothing there. The rustle came again, closer this time. It wasn't a natural sound. It was calculated, like something testing the limits of its prey. My hand tightened around the flashlight, its cold metal slippery with sweat. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs as the light swept over the edge of the clearing. Then I saw it. At first it was just a shimmer in the darkness, a distortion in the air like heat rising from pavement. But as I stared, The shape began to solidify, its edges rippling as if resisting the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form hunched and angular, its limbs too long and too thin to be human. My breath caught as the flashlight's beam landed on its face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there, just a void, a swirling absence that seemed to pull the light into itself. It didn't move, but its presence pressed against me like a physical weight. My chest tightened, and I realized I wasn't breathing. My lungs screamed for air, but my body refused to respond. The thing stood there, motionless, yet its very existence felt like an attack. My vision blurred, my head pounding as I stumbled back a step, then another. The flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering as if it too was struggling against the thing in the dark. Panic surged through me, and I turned, my legs barely responding as I forced them to move. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and bending like the distorted edges of a nightmare. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, soft and shifting, as though the forest itself was trying to pull me under. I didn't know how far I ran or in what direction. My focus was singular. Keep moving. The shadows moved with me, their presence pressing against my back. A cold, suffocating weight that refused to let me go. My flashlight dimmed further, its light growing weaker with every step, until it was little more than a flickering glow. I stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller and more enclosed, the trees pressing inward like a cage. In the center was something that made my stomach drop. A small wooden structure, barely more than a haphazard pile of branches and stones. It was eerily similar to the shrine we had seen before, but this one felt different. It felt alive. The symbols carved into the stones glowed faintly, their jagged lines pulsing in time with the frantic beat of my heart. The air here was colder, sharper, and the metallic scent was stronger, nearly overwhelming. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees before the structure, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The hum returned, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It resonated through the clearing, vibrating through my bones, making it impossible to think. I clutched my head, my fingers digging into my scalp as the sound built to a deafening crescendo. The light from the symbols flared, bright and blinding, and for a moment I thought I would be swallowed by it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. I opened my eyes, blinking against the darkness that had returned to the clearing. The symbols no longer glowed, and the structure looked lifeless once more. But the air was different now, charged, electric, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A faint whisper broke the silence, soft and distant, curling around me like smoke. It wasn't a voice, not really, but it carried the weight of words, the implication of meaning. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but its presence was unmistakable. It was here. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady, as I backed away from the structure. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to ripple, their movements slow and deliberate. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely piercing the darkness. I turned and stumbled back into the forest, the weight of the whispers following me, growing louder with every step. The forest felt endless now, its paths twisting and looping back on themselves. My mind raced, trying to piece together a plan, an escape, but there was none. Whatever had taken Marla, whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let me go. I didn't stop running until I tripped over something solid, crashing hard onto the damp earth. Pain shot through my knee, but I ignored it, scrambling to see what I had fallen over. My flashlight's weak beam illuminated a familiar shape. A torn backpack, its contents scattered across the ground. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't the same one we had found earlier. It was a different backpack, one I recognized immediately. It was mine. The sight of my backpack froze me in place. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but no explanation made sense. It was mine, down to the fraying strap and the faded initials scrawled on the corner. I hadn't seen it since we left the base camp that morning. Unwinding, seen it since we left the base camp that morning. How could it be here, miles into the forest, when I hadn't dropped it? The hum returned, faint and far off, like an echo bouncing through the trees. It crept into my ears, low and persistent, seeping into my thoughts and unraveling them. My hand shook as I reached out, fingers brushing against the damp fabric of the bag. It was cold, colder than it should have been, as though it had been sitting in ice. I unzipped the main compartment, my breath hitching as I peered inside. It was empty, not just empty of my gear, but hollow in a way that defied logic. The interior was darker than it should have been, a void that seemed to swallow the weak beam of my flashlight. I pulled back, my chest tightening as the hum grew louder, vibrating in my skull like the drone of an angry hornet. I let go of the bag, stumbling to my feet and backing away, but the shadows around me seemed to close in, pushing me toward it. The forest felt smaller now, the trees leaning inward, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The backpack sat in the center of the clearing, inert and silent, yet radiating a presence I couldn't shake. I wanted to run, to escape whatever was happening, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. A faint whisper joined the hum, weaving through it like a thread. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it carried a weight, a meaning that pressed against my mind. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight trembling in my grip. As I scanned the trees, the shadows were moving again, shifting in ways that defied the light, their edges flickering like broken film. I took a shaky step back, my foot catching on a root, and I stumbled. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground and spinning in a slow circle. Its beam illuminated the edge of the clearing, And that was when I saw it. Another structure. It was smaller than the shrine we'd found earlier, more haphazard, as though it had been thrown together in a hurry. The branches and stones were slick with moisture, the symbols etched into them crude and uneven, but it was the object in the center that made my breath catch. It was a photograph pinned to the stone by a rusted nail. The edges were curled, the image faded, but it was unmistakable. It was of my group, me, Marla, Jackson, and the others, standing at the edge of the forest before we set out. My throat tightened as I stepped closer, the weak beam of my flashlight illuminating the image fully. Our faces were blurred, distorted in ways that made my stomach churn. Our eyes were dark pits, our mouths twisted into unnatural shapes, as though the photograph had been stretched and warped by unseen hands. And beneath the image, scrawled in jagged letters that cut deep into the stone, were two words: not enough. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. The words were clearer now, fragments of something I couldn't fully understand, but they carried an urgency that made my skin crawl. I backed away from the structure, my heart pounding as the hum reached a crescendo, drowning out the whispers and my own thoughts. The ground beneath me shifted, the earth rippling like water. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the trees around me seemed to twist and bend, their trunks warping into impossible angles. The shadows at the edge of the clearing surged forward, their movements frantic and chaotic. I scrambled back, my hands clawing at the dirt as the void pressed closer, its cold, suffocating presence wrapping around me like a shroud. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The shadows retreated, melting back into the forest. The hum faded, replaced by a silence so profound it felt deafening. The photograph was gone, the stone bare and lifeless. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. I stayed there, crouched on the ground, my body trembling as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The forest felt different now, heavier, as though it had been altered by whatever had just unfolded. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me, and began to move. Each step feeling like a monumental effort. The path was unfamiliar, the trees pressing closer, their twisted forms like the ribs of a massive beast. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in near total darkness. The metallic scent returned, sharp and acrid, burning the back of my throat. I reached out, my hands brushing against the rough bark of a tree as I tried to steady myself. That was when I heard it, a single voice, soft and distant, yet unmistakable. It was calling my name. The voice that called my name was soft, almost familiar, but it carried a weight that froze me in place. It came from the trees, echoing faintly, but the forest around me remained still, suffocatingly quiet. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to listen, hoping, praying that I had imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time, My name, spoken with a deliberate slowness, the syllables stretching unnaturally. I wanted to run, to force my legs to move, but fear rooted me to the spot. The air around me felt heavier, colder, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned slowly, my flashlight dead in my hand, its useless weight a bitter reminder of how vulnerable I was. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, but it only made the shadows deeper, their shapes twisting into forms that didn't belong. The voice called again, sharper now, almost impatient. It came from a direction I couldn't pinpoint, seeming to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. I moved forward, drawn not by curiosity, but by a need to confront whatever was out there. My steps were slow, hesitant, the crunch of leaves underfoot unnaturally loud in the silence. The forest pressed closer with every step, the branches above knitting into a canopy, so dense it felt like the world had shrunk to just this one path. The voice called my name again, and this time it sounded different, warmer, pleading. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just any voice. It was Marla's. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Couldn't be her. I had seen her vanish, consumed by the shadows. Her scream cut short, as if the forest itself had taken her. But the voice, it was hers. It carried the same cadence, the same slight rasp that I had heard 1,000 times before. "Help me," the voice said, faint and trembling. It sounded close now, just beyond the wall of trees ahead. "Wah, please, Bart." My heart pounded as I pushed through the underbrush, the branches clawing at my arms and legs. I didn't stop to think, didn't let myself question the impossibility of what I was hearing. All I could focus on was the sound of Marla's voice, the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she was still alive. The trees opened into another clearing, smaller than the others, but no less unsettling. In the center stood a figure, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. My breath hitched as I recognized her. Marla, her back to me, her hair tangled and matted, her shoulders hunched as if she were in pain. Marla. Siu, Shin, Del, Cha. My voice cracked, the word barely audible. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. Her head was bowed, her arms hanging limply at her sides. I took a cautious step forward, the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a physical force. "Marla," I said again, louder this time. "It's me. Are you?" "Ah." She turned and the words died in my throat. Her face was wrong. "Really get it all. Can enter you and Frey. Ah, can't even." The features were hers, but they were distorted, stretched in ways that defied logic. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to devour the faint light of the clearing. Her mouth moved, forming words that didn't reach my ears, her jaw unhinging unnaturally wide with each motion. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Well, see through the dot. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Marla, or whatever was wearing her face, took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground and up into my chest. It drowned out every rational thought, leaving only the primal need to escape. Marla moved closer, her head tilting at an impossible angle, her hollow eyes locked on mine. Then she spoke, her voice a grotesque imitation of itself. You left me. The words hit like a physical blow, guilt and fear twisting together in my stomach. My chest tightened as I took another step back, shaking my head. No, I didn't. You left me, she said again, her voice rising. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as she closed the distance between us. You left us all. Her hand shot out, faster than I could react, her fingers cold and unyielding as they wrapped around my wrist. Pain lanced up my arm, and I cried out, struggling against her grip. The shadows around her seemed to ripple, reaching out like living things, their edges sharp and jagged. I pulled free with a desperate jerk, stumbling back and falling hard onto the ground. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and turned, running blindly into the forest. The hum followed me, a relentless vibration that seemed to emanate from within my own skull. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. The path ahead nothing more than a blur of shadow and motion. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't dare stop. The voice called after me, growing fainter, but no less chilling. The words distorted and fragmented. You can't run forever, it said, almost a whisper now. It will find you. And okay. The ground beneath me shifted, and I tripped, crashing to my knees. I stayed there for a moment, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. The forest around me was silent again, the hum gone, but the weight of its presence lingered. I looked down at my hands, bloodied and raw from the fall, and realized something was clutched tightly in my fist. It was a piece of paper, torn and crumpled, the edges damp with sweat and dirt. My stomach turned as I smoothed it out, the jagged lines of a symbol staring back at me, burned into the page like a brand. The same symbol we had seen at the shrine, the same one that had taken Marla. The symbol stared up at me, jagged and dark, like it had been etched into the paper with something sharp and unrelenting. My fingers trembled as I held it, the edges crumpling under my grip. It didn't make sense. None of this did. I hadn't seen this before, hadn't written it, and yet it felt familiar, as though it had been burned into my mind long before I ever laid eyes on it. The air around me was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that doesn't just exist but actively consumes sound. Even the forest, which had been alive with strange noises only moments ago, felt dead now. I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart, each beat like a drum in the void. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. The paper slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the ground like it was trying to escape. But I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. The sight of it made my chest tighten, a weight settling on my lungs, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Something shifted behind me, a faint rustle, barely audible, but it was enough to send a chill racing down my spine. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows, layered and deep, pressing against the edges of my vision. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, the lingering effects of whatever had just happened. But I knew better. The forest was watching me. I started walking, every step feeling like a battle against the overwhelming urge to stop and curl into myself. The trees were closer now, their trunks twisting and warped, the branches above weaving into a dense canopy that blocked out even the faintest sliver of moonlight. My flashlight was still dead, useless in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to drop it. It was a tether, a small, meaningless comfort in the face of the void. The path beneath me was uneven, roots and stones jutting out like traps. But I pressed on, forcing myself to keep moving. The silence followed me, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. My mind screamed for me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I didn't know where to go. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that offered no escape. The hum returned, soft at first, like the distant vibration of a far-off engine. It grew steadily louder, resonating through the ground, through my bones, until it felt like it was coming from within me. I stopped, my body trembling as the sound filled my ears, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just noise. It was a presence, invasive and all-consuming, pressing against the edges of my mind. And then it spoke, not in words, not exactly, but in thoughts, impressions that crawled through my mind like insects. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it carried a weight, an authority that left no room for doubt. The message was clear, even if I couldn't fully understand it. You are marked. The words, or whatever they were, sent a jolt of terror through me. My hand flew to my arm, where Marla's twisted grip had burned like ice against my skin. I pulled back my sleeve, half expecting to see something, but the flesh was unmarked. Still, the sensation lingered, a cold that seeped into my bones, refusing to leave. The forest shifted around me, the trees bending inward as if drawn by some unseen force. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I staggered forward, clutching my head as the sound drilled into my skull. The world tilted, the ground beneath me rippling like water, and for a moment I thought I was falling. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't on the path anymore. I was standing in another clearing, though it felt more like I had been placed there than had stumbled upon it. In the center was another structure, larger and more elaborate than the ones before. Stones were piled high, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, like the beating of a heart. At the top of the structure was something that made my blood run cold. A figure, its form barely discernible in the dim light. crouched atop the stones. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. Its head tilted toward me, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze, sharp and piercing, cutting through me like a blade. The hum stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like the world had ceased to exist. The figure moved, slowly, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It reached out a hand, long, skeletal fingers that stretched toward me, and the forest seemed to shudder in response. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by a force I couldn't see or fight. The figure's hand hovered inches from my chest, and the cold that radiated from it was unbearable, sinking into me like ice water. I gasped, my breath visible in the freezing air, and for a moment I thought I saw something in its outstretched palm, the symbol, ambiance, the same one from the shrine, from the paper, from the stones. It pulsed faintly, a soft, rhythmic glow that matched the beating of my heart. The figure didn't speak, but its intent was clear. It wanted me to take it. I reached out, my hand trembling as it moved toward the figure's palm. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my body didn't listen. The moment my fingers touched the symbol, the world shattered. Light and sound exploded around me. A deafening cacophony that drowned out everything else. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling, tumbling through a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. The hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through my very being. And then, darkness. The darkness enveloped me completely, an all-consuming void that pressed against my chest like a weight. I didn't know if I was still falling, or if I had simply stopped existing altogether. There was no up, no down, no sense of direction, just an overwhelming emptiness that felt both infinite and suffocating. The hum lingered, a low vibration that seemed to pulse within my very bones. It wasn't deafening anymore, but its presence was far worse now, insidious and omnipresent, as though it had seeped into me. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the oppressive weight of the void. Then, faintly at first, I began to hear whispers. They curled around me like smoke, indistinct and fragmented, their meanings just out of reach. The voices layered on top of one another, growing louder and more urgent, until they became a cacophony that filled my head. My hands flew to my ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't external. It was inside me, crawling through my thoughts, unraveling them thread by thread. You are chosen. The words cut through the chaos, sharp and deliberate. They weren't spoken, but etched into my mind, undeniable and unyielding. I tried to respond, to scream, but my voice was gone. I was utterly powerless, a speck of dust swallowed by something far greater than myself. Envelop. The whispers quieted, fading into the background as a faint glow appeared in the distance. It was small at first, a pinprick of light in the vast expanse of darkness, but it grew steadily, its brightness cutting through the void. My body moved toward it, though I wasn't sure if I was walking or being pulled. The light was cold, its glow unnatural and sterile, but it was the only thing in this nothingness, and I clung to it like a lifeline. As I neared the source, the light resolved into a shape, a doorway, its edges jagged and uneven, as though it had been torn into the fabric of reality itself. The symbols were there again, carved into the frame, their lines glowing faintly. They pulsed in rhythm with the hum, drawing me closer with each beat. I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But there was nowhere to go. The void stretched endlessly behind me, an infinite abyss that promised nothing but oblivion. Whatever lay beyond the doorway, it was better than this. It had to be. I stepped through. The transition was immediate, jarring. The oppressive weight of the void lifted, replaced by an intense cold that bit into my skin. I was standing in a vast, desolate landscape. The ground beneath me cracked and lifeless. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, shot through with veins of pale, flickering light. It wasn't night or day, but something in between. A perpetual twilight that cast the world in shades of gray. The hum was louder here, resonating through the air like a heartbeat. It seemed to emanate from the horizon, where a massive structure loomed. It was impossible to tell how far away it was. Its scale was incomprehensible, its jagged spires stretching high into the churning sky. The symbols were etched into its surface, their glow faint but constant, like embers in a dying fire. I didn't want to move, but the pull was undeniable. My legs carried me forward, each step heavy and deliberate, as though the ground itself resisted my presence. The whispers returned, soft and indistinct, weaving through the hum like a melody just out of reach. They weren't hostile anymore. They were almost inviting. The closer I got to the structure, the more I began to notice shapes in the distance. Figures moving through the gray haze, their forms barely visible. They didn't seem to notice me, their movements slow and deliberate, like shadows cast by something unseen. My stomach churned as I realized their outlines were familiar, twisted echoes of faces I knew. Marla, Dr. I'll be Phil, Dead Tell, Jackson, Dr. Pam, Doduviel, Shish, the others. I called out to them, but my voice was swallowed by the hum. They didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. Their forms blurred as I moved closer, merging with the haze until they disappeared completely. I wanted to follow, to chase them, but the pull of the structure was too strong. It dominated everything, its presence overwhelming, its edges sharp and stark against the endless gray. When I finally reached the base of the structure, I was overcome by its sheer magnitude. The symbols carved into its surface glowed brighter now, their light pulsing in time with the hum. The doorway was there, a gaping maw that seemed to lead into nothingness. The cold radiating from it was almost unbearable, cutting through me like knives. I stepped inside. The interior was vast and empty, the walls lined with the same glowing symbols. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through my chest, my head, my very soul. At the center of the space was a single object, a pedestal, and atop it, the symbol. It hovered there, suspended in midair, its edges flickering like flame. I didn't want to approach it, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved of their own accord, each step pulling me closer to the pedestal. The whispers were louder now, their voices weaving together into a single unified chant. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. This was the end, and the beginning. When I reached the pedestal, the symbol flared, its light blinding and all-encompassing. The hum reached a crescendo, a final deafening roar that shook the very foundations of reality. My hands moved without thought, reaching for the symbol, and the moment my fingers touched it, the world shattered. There was no pain, no fear, only light, endless and overwhelming. The whispers faded, replaced by a single voice, calm and absolute. You are part of it now. And then, nothing. The air in Ironwood felt different from the moment I stepped out of my car. Thicker, colder, carrying an oppressive weight that settled in my chest. The trees surrounded the small town like silent sentinels, their dark branches clawing at the gray sky. I had seen forests before, but nothing like this. There was something unnatural about the way the trees leaned, their shadows stretching just a little too far, as if reaching for anyone foolish enough to wander too close. The campsite was a 20-minute hike from where I parked, nestled deep within the woods. The local deputy had marked the trail for me, though his warnings about staying out past sunset had been unnecessary. I wasn't here to indulge in local folklore or entertain their superstitions. I was here to find answers. The missing couple's names were Megan and Dylan Parker, newlyweds. Panning way too tightly. They had come to Ironwood for a quiet escape, a honeymoon away from the world. But instead of postcards and happy memories, their families got silence. The park ranger found their campsite 3 days ago, empty except for their tent and a cold fire pit. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, just the unsettling emptiness of belongings, abandoned mid-use. I reached the clearing just as the clouds began to gather overhead. The campsite looked exactly as the photos had shown. The tent was zipped closed, a pair of hiking boots neatly placed at the entrance. Nearby, a faded picnic blanket was spread over the ground, its edges weighed down by stones. A empty thermos, and an open journal lay next to it, untouched by the elements. I approached the tent first, crouching low to peer inside. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of damp fabric and something metallic, like rust. The sleeping bags were still laid out, zipped together in a neat cocoon. A flashlight sat on one side, its batteries dead. Everything about the scene felt wrong. Not because of what was missing, but because of what wasn't. No signs of panic, no scattered belongings. Sevilla, Tatumdale, Tualis, Iarly, Shogunolid. It was as though they had simply ceased to exist. The journal caught my attention next. This. The handwriting was neat, the lines carefully filled with mundane details about their trip. Places they had visited, meals they had eaten, things they planned to do. But the entries grew shorter as the pages went on, the handwriting more erratic. The final entry stopped me cold. The trees are different here. They're watching us. I think something's in the woods. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as a faint breeze rustled through the clearing. I stood, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest was unnervingly quiet, not even the sound of birds or insects to break the stillness. Just the faint creak of branches swaying in the wind. I moved toward the fire pit, crouching to examine the ashes. They were cold, long since extinguished, but something about the arrangement caught my attention. The stones around the pit weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern, a rough circle with jagged lines crossing through the center. It looked like a symbol, though its meaning was lost on me. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper that made me freeze. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but a sound that mimicked one. A low, mournful hum that seemed to come from deep within the forest. My pulse quickened as I stood, turning slowly toward the source. The trees loomed closer now, their shadows bleeding into the clearing, darker than they had any right to be. I stepped back toward the tent, my boots crunching on the gravel-like soil. Egmf, announced to the growl. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, though the words were impossible to make out. My flashlight felt heavy in my hand as I flicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the encroaching gloom. The light barely penetrated the darkness, the shadows seeming to absorb it. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a flicker of motion between the trees, too fast to follow. My breath hitched as I swung the flashlight in its direction, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows, swaying gently in the wind. The whispering stopped. The sudden silence was worse, pressing against my ears like cotton, amplifying the sound of my own breathing. I scanned the campsite one last time, my flashlight catching on the edges of the tent and the glint of the journal's cover. My gut told me to leave, to return to the safety of my car and call it a day. But something deeper pushed me forward, a gnawing need to understand, to find the missing pieces of the puzzle. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the trees rising like walls around me. My fingers brushed against the bark of one, rough and cold to the touch. A faint mark caught my eye, a series of deep, deliberate scratches carved into the trunk. They weren't random. They were symbols, jagged and angular, matching the pattern around the fire pit. A sound broke the silence then, a sharp, snapping noise, like a branch being twisted until it shattered. It came from deeper in the woods, impossibly loud in the stillness. I turned toward it, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Hello. Near thee. My voice barely rose above a whisper, swallowed almost instantly by the forest. Another snap, closer this time. My chest tightened as I took a step back, the light dancing wildly across the trees. The shadows shifted again, moving in ways that defied logic, as though they had a will of their own. My heart pounded as I turned, my eyes darting between the trees, searching for something, anything, that made sense. And then I saw it. At first it was just a shape, a vague outline, barely visible against the darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, the details sharpened. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs stretched and angular, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, its head tilted as though watching me. The whisper returned, louder now, curling around me like smoke. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place as the thing shifted closer, its form blurring at the edges, like a shadow that had stepped free of its source. I didn't wait to see what it would do. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned, sprinting back toward the trail. The flashlight bobbed wildly in my hand, the beam barely illuminating the ground ahead. The forest seemed alive now, the trees twisting and bending as though reaching for me. The whisper followed, growing louder, more insistent, until it became a roar in my ears. My lungs burned, my legs screaming with each frantic step. But I didn't dare slow down. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of my car's headlights through the trees, a beacon in the suffocating darkness. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one frantic motion. The whispering stopped the moment the engine roared to life, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the hum of the motor. But as I drove away, the trees looming in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Whatever was in those woods, it had seen me. And it wasn't finished. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the crack in the curtains where the dim glow of the parking lot seeped through. Every creak of the floorboards above, every faint rustle of leaves outside the window made me flinch. My mind kept replaying the thing I'd seen at the edge of the woods. Silma, ours, bohemian, muddy-eyed, at the edge of the woods. Its angular, unnatural movements, the way it had seemed to bend the shadows around it. I'd run from it, but it didn't feel like enough. It wasn't just the presence of something lurking in the woods. It was the way the forest itself had seemed alive, bending and twisting to block my path. It felt like I'd escaped by chance, not by my own doing. By the time the first light of dawn bled into the sky, I had already dressed and packed my things. I couldn't stay in that room, in this town, knowing what was out there, but the thought of leaving without answers gnawed at me. Megan and Dylan were still missing. Whatever had taken them or chased them was still out there, watching. I spent the morning at the sheriff's office, poring over the files. Most of the reports were sparse, hastily written accounts of hikers or campers who had vanished without a trace. The dates spanned decades, each set of disappearances eerily similar in circumstances, always near the same part of the woods, always without any sign of struggle. The earliest case went back to 1956. A family of 3 who had been camping near the same trailhead I'd visited, but there was one report that stood out. It was from 1973, filed by a woman named Edith Harper, who claimed to have seen her husband disappear before her eyes. Her account was strange and fragmented, full of words like the shadows moved. And it wasn't human. The local authorities had dismissed her as hysterical, but the detail that struck me was the location, near a place called Ironwood Hollow. I asked the sheriff about it, but his expression darkened, and he refused to say much. "There's nothing out there but old stories," he said, but the way his gaze flicked toward the window made me think otherwise. The map in the office showed the area surrounding the town, a sprawling expanse of dense forest and winding trails. Ironwood Hollow was marked faintly, almost as an afterthought. Deep within the woods, I traced the route with my finger, noting the narrow dirt road that led to the edge of the forest, where the trail began. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The path leading into the forest was overgrown, barely visible under the layer of fallen leaves and moss. The trees loomed closer together here, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out much of the light. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the forest itself was warning me to stay out. But I didn't turn back. I couldn't. Something about this place pulled at me, a quiet compulsion I couldn't explain. The sound of my boots crunching on the underbrush was the only noise as I ventured deeper, the forest swallowing the sound like a thick blanket. The trail grew narrower as I went, the trees pressing closer until they felt almost suffocating. I kept my flashlight in my hand, though the weak sunlight filtering through the canopy was just enough to see by. I marked my path as I went, tying strips of cloth to low-hanging branches, a habit drilled into me during search and rescue training. I couldn't afford to get lost out here. The first sign of something wrong was the silence. Dem dulveilen, body blue, ta doi ta. It wasn't just the absence of bird song or insects. It was an unnatural stillness, as though the forest was holding its breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint shimmer, a distortion in the air like heat rising off pavement. It hovered between the trees, barely noticeable, but as I moved closer, The shape began to solidify. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that stretched and twisted unnaturally. Its form flickered at the edges, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thing didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against my mind like a physical weight. My heart pounded as I slowly raised the flashlight. The beam slicing through the dim light and landing on the creature. It didn't react. It simply stood there, watching, or at least I thought it was watching. Its face, if it had one, was a blank void, a swirling darkness that seemed to draw the light into itself. I couldn't look at it for long without feeling nauseous, my vision swimming as though the world around it were bending and warping. The whisper started again, low and indistinct, curling through the trees like smoke. It wasn't coming from the creature. It was all around me, threading through the silence. The words were incomprehensible, but their tone was clear, a warning, or perhaps a threat. I took a step back, my movements slow and deliberate. The creature didn't follow, but its form flickered, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from the forest itself. Then, without warning, the creature lunged. I didn't see it move. One moment it was still. The next it was inches from me, its presence suffocating. I stumbled back, barely managing to stay on my feet as the flashlight slipped from my hand, the beam spinning wildly across the forest floor. I ran, my legs burned, my lungs screaming as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. The forest seemed alive now, shifting and twisting to block my path. The whispering followed me, a relentless cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. When I finally broke through the trees and into the clearing, the trailhead and my car came into view. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me, the engine roaring to life. I drove without looking back, the whispers fading as the road stretched out before me. But even as I left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't let me go. Not completely. The creature, the whispers, the way the forest had seemed to shift around me. It was still with me, lingering just at the edges of my mind. And I knew it wasn't over. The drive back to the motel was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly. My knuckles ached. The engine hummed beneath me, a monotonous sound that did little to drown out the whispers still echoing in my head. Every shadow along the roadside, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision felt like the creature had followed me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. By the time I parked outside my room, the sun was low on the horizon, its fading light casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The motel was quiet, the kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. I stepped out of the car and froze. And something was wrong. The air felt heavier, colder than it should have been, even for this late in the day. My gaze swept across the parking lot, the empty spaces and the darkened windows. Nothing moved. No sound, not even the faint rustle of the wind. My pulse quickened as I approached my door, my keys jangling in my trembling hand. Inside, the room was just as I'd left it. Bed, unmade, papers scattered across the desk, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the air. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the deadbolt. The action more instinctual than necessary. Safety felt like an illusion now, but I needed the comfort, however false it was. I sat at the desk, my eyes scanning the case files I'd collected earlier. Pages and pages of missing persons reports, each one more cryptic than the last. The details blurred together in my mind. Dates, names, locations, all of it pointing to the same pattern, the same stretch of forest, the same inexplicable vanishings. Taken down wishings, had two dead, and then there was the photo. You would say it was tucked into the corner of one of the reports. A grainy black and white image that had been taken decades ago. It showed a group of people standing at the edge of the forest, their faces barely discernible in the shadows. In the center of the group stood a figure taller than the rest, its features obscured, but its presence undeniable. My breath hitched as I traced its outline with my finger. The same angular, inhuman shape that I'd seen in the woods. I flipped the photo over, hoping for some clue, some explanation. There was a single word scrawled on the back, in faded ink, hollow. The whispers returned, faint at first, threading through the silence like smoke. My head snapped up, my eyes darting to the corners of the room. And you, dancer. The shadows seemed deeper now, pooling in the spaces where the dim light from the single lamp couldn't reach. I held my breath, listening, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, curling through my thoughts like a venomous thread. My phone buzzed on the desk, the sudden vibration making me jump. I grabbed it, desperate for the distraction, but the screen only made my unease grow. It wasn't a call or a message. It was a video file sent from an unknown number. The thumbnail was dark, grainy, but I could make out the faint outline of trees. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but curiosity won out. I tapped the file, and the video began to play. The image was shaky, the camera moving through the forest at night. The person holding it was breathing heavily, their steps uneven and frantic. The beam of a flashlight swung wildly across the trees, illuminating patches of bark and foliage, but little else. Then the camera stopped, focusing on something in the distance. It was the creature, even through the poor quality of the video. Its form was unmistakable, tall and angular, its limbs impossibly long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood at the edge of the light, just watching, its featureless face tilting slightly, as though it were studying whoever held the camera. The video cut to static for a moment, and when it returned, the angle had changed. The camera was on the ground now, the view tilted upward toward the sky. The flashlight was still on, casting its beam into the branches above. But the figure was gone. In its place, the shadows began to move, writhing and twisting, as though alive. The screen went black, but the audio continued. The breathing had stopped, replaced by a low hum that grew steadily louder, more oppressive. I dropped the phone, the sound still echoing from the tiny speaker as the hum morphed into something else. A voice. My name. Ah. I slammed my hand over the phone, silencing it. But the voice lingered in my mind, sharp and clear. It wasn't just calling me. It was summoning me. It was summoning me. My breathing was shallow as I sat there, the silence in the room now deafening. I could feel it, the weight of something pressing against me, something just out of sight. The air was cold, almost freezing, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. I couldn't stay. Grabbing my coat and flashlight, I bolted for the door, my keys jangling in my hand as I fumbled with the lock. The parking lot was just as empty as before. The motel bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. I climbed into my car, the engine roaring to life, and pulled onto the road without a destination in mind. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette against the horizon, like a wound in the earth. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I drove toward it, unable to stop myself. The pull was stronger now, an invisible thread winding tighter with each passing moment. As the road narrowed, the hum returned, faint but insistent, threading through the static on the radio. I turned it off, but the sound didn't stop. It was everywhere, in the air, in my head, a constant reminder that I was being watched. The trailhead came into view, the same spot I'd fled from just hours ago. I parked, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the trees. The whispers started again, faint and indistinct, but unmistakable. They were waiting for me. Ah. Shh. The forest seemed to swallow the headlights as I stepped out of the car, their faint glow absorbed by the endless wall of trees. The air was colder here, biting at my skin and filling my lungs with a sharpness that made me shiver. The hum was louder now, no longer just a vibration in my chest, but a low, persistent sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It thrummed beneath my feet, drawing me closer to the trail. The flashlight in my hand flickered as I clicked it on, its weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave this cursed place behind. But something kept pulling me forward, a compulsion I couldn't explain, as if the forest had reached into my mind and planted the thought there. The trailhead loomed ahead, a narrow path winding into the shadows. The trees on either side leaned closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining to form an archway that felt less like an invitation and more like a trap. My boots crunched on the gravel as I stepped onto the path, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The hum deepened as I walked, its pitch dropping to a guttural resonance that made my stomach twist. The whispers started again, soft and distant, threading through the air like a faint breeze. At first, they were indistinct, a collection of sounds that didn't quite form words. But the farther I went, the more deliberate they became, shaping into fragmented sentences that sent a chill racing down my spine. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was something else entirely, a sound that seemed to exist outside of me and within me at the same time. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The symbols appeared first, carved into the bark of the trees on either side of the path. They were crude but deliberate, jagged lines that twisted into shapes that felt wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. The light from the flashlight seemed to bend around them, the edges of the symbols blurring as if they were moving just out of sight. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on them, a sharp pain stabbing through my temples. I forced myself to keep moving, each step heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from all around me. The words were clearer, their tone accusatory, angry. You took what wasn't yours. Edgar. Boss. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't take anything. Well, Bius the other la. But the guilt pressed down on me anyway, a weight that made it harder to breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, but the voices didn't give me time. They surged forward, louder, more demanding. You can't leave now. The path opened suddenly into a clearing, the abruptness of it catching me off guard. I stumbled to a stop, my flashlight sweeping across the space. In the center of the clearing stood something that made my blood run cold. It was a stone altar, its surface rough and stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Around it were more of the symbols, carved into the ground, their lines glowing faintly in the darkness. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the air, the earth, and my body. I stepped closer, drawn to the altar, despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The symbols seemed to pulse with each step I took, their light growing brighter, more frantic. The whispers reached a crescendo, their voices overlapping into a single, incomprehensible roar. Then everything stopped. The hum, the whispers, the pulsing light, all of it ceased in an instant, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. And then I felt it, a presence behind me, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from it. My body stiffened, every muscle locking in place as my mind screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so deep It felt like it had been carved into my very bones. The presence moved. A subtle shift in the air that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare acknowledge it, but I could feel it, its gaze boring into me, its weight pressing down on me like a physical force. The whispers started again, softer now, a single voice that curled around me like smoke. Look, I didn't want to. I couldn't, but my body betrayed me. My head turning slowly, the flashlight slipping from my grasp as I faced whatever was behind me. It was the creature. The same angular, inhuman form I had seen before. Its limbs stretched and distorted, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its featureless face tilted toward me, the void where its eyes should have been piercing through me. It stepped forward, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. The ground beneath it rippled with each step, the symbols on the altar flaring brighter as it approached. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from anger to something else. Anticipation. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. The creature loomed over me now, its void-like face mere inches from mine. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single deafening word: submit. And envelop, disable, amopa, Dave. The light from the altar flared, blinding and all-consuming, and then everything went dark. The darkness wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, pressing against me from all sides, as if the void itself had taken form. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but I could feel something coiled around me, cold and invasive, worming its way into my thoughts. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat a desperate attempt to ground me in a reality that felt like it was slipping away. The whispers returned, softer now, but more insistent, threading through the void like a predator's breath against the back of my neck. They weren't just sounds. They were sensations invading my mind, dragging me toward something I didn't want to see. I clenched my fists, trying to fight the pull, but the effort felt futile. I was being unraveled, piece by piece. A faint glow pierced the darkness, distant and weak, but enough to pull my focus. It flickered, struggling against the oppressive black, but with each beat of my heart, it grew stronger. The whispers faltered, their edges blurring, as if the light was burning through them. I moved toward it. Or maybe I was being pulled. My legs didn't feel like they were my own anymore. My steps slow and unsteady. The glow resolved into a shape, a figure standing motionless in the void. As I drew closer, the details sharpened, and my breath caught in my throat. It was me. The figure was a perfect reflection, down to the torn sleeve on my jacket and the blood on my knuckles. But its eyes weren't right. They were hollow, pits of shadow that seemed to stretch infinitely, pulling everything toward them. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through me, my body freezing as the whispers surged back. Louder now, angrier. This is what you are. The words weren't spoken. They were imprinted, etched into my mind with a force that made my head throb. The figure tilted its head, its movements too sharp, too deliberate. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and for a moment I felt myself being drawn into them, the void inside it reaching out to claim me. I staggered back, my chest heaving, but the figure didn't move. Instead, the void around it began to ripple, the darkness bleeding outward in jagged waves. The glow dimmed, flickering like a dying ember, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. "Take it." A jagged shape materialized between me and the figure, floating in the air like a shard of broken glass. It pulsed with a faint, sickly light, its edges sharp and undefined. I didn't want to touch it, didn't even want to look at it, but the pull was overwhelming. My hands moved of their own accord, reaching out toward the shard as the whispers chanted around me. The moment my fingers touched it, the void collapsed. The force of it threw me backward, my body slamming into the ground with a bone-jarring impact. I gasped for air, my lungs burning as the oppressive weight lifted. The world came rushing back in a cacophony of sound and light, the forest spinning around me like a broken carousel. I was back in the clearing. The altar was still there, the symbols on its surface, dim but pulsing faintly, as though alive. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing against my chest. My hands were empty, but the sensation of the shard remained, a cold ache in my palms that refused to fade. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost worse. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me as I took in the scene. The clearing felt different now, emptier, darker. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt metal. I turned toward the path, desperate to leave. But the forest seemed different, the trees more twisted, their shadows deeper. The trail I had followed was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gnarled roots and tangled branches. Panic surged through me as I realized the forest was shifting, closing in and around me like a living thing. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver racing down my spine. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, more like the rumble of distant thunder twisted into something alive. I turned toward the source, my heart pounding as the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move. The creature emerged, its form flickering like a poorly tuned signal. It was taller now, its limbs longer, its movements more erratic. The void where its face should have been seemed to pulse, the darkness within it alive and writhing. It didn't move toward me, but its presence pressed against me, suffocating and inescapable. The whispers returned, faint and distorted, but this time they weren't directed at me. They surrounded the creature, weaving through the air like a dark hymn, their tone reverent, almost worshipful. The symbols on the altar flared brighter, their light casting jagged shadows across the clearing. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears, as the creature tilted its head toward the altar. The whispers grew louder, their chant rising in pitch and intensity, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. I didn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. Something was waking up. The creature turned its hollow gaze back to me, and for the first time, I felt it, not just its presence, but its intent. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting. For what? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for certain. Knew one thing for certain. I wasn't getting out of this forest alive. The ground trembled beneath me, the vibrations coursing up through my legs and into my chest like an unsteady heartbeat. The whispers twisted into something harsher, their edges sharper, grating against my thoughts like static. The creature loomed at the edge of the clearing, its jagged form flickering as if it existed between moments, caught in a space I couldn't comprehend. The symbols on the altar flared brighter, their glow almost blinding against the suffocating darkness. The light cast jagged shadows across the clearing, but the shadows didn't move as they should have. They stretched and twisted unnaturally, converging at the center of the altar, like dark veins reaching for something buried within. My breath caught as I stumbled back, the weight of the air pressing against my chest. It wasn't just the creature anymore. The forest itself was alive, bending and shifting around me, its presence a growing pressure that threatened to crush me. I wanted to run, but the path was gone, the trees closing in like a living cage. Every step backward felt futile, the clearing swallowing me whole, pulling me closer to the altar and the impossible thing standing before it. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and oppressive, filling the space between my ribs and wrapping around my lungs like a vice. My ears strained against it, searching for any sound, any hint of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet, vast, and consuming. The creature moved. It was slow at first, deliberate, its limbs bending in unnatural angles as it stepped toward the altar. Its void-like face remained fixed on me, the emptiness where its eyes should have been drilling into my soul. Each step it took made the air grow colder, the light from the altar pulsing weaker with every movement. My hands shook as I clutched at nothing, desperate for something to ground me, something to fight back with. But there was nothing. When it reached the altar, the creature stopped. Its jagged form bent forward, long fingers curling around the edge of the stone. The light from the symbols flickered violently, and the ground beneath me cracked, thin lines splintering outward from the altar like veins. A low hum began to build, deep and resonant, vibrating through the earth and into my chest. I couldn't move. My legs felt frozen, my body weighed down by the sheer presence of the thing before me. I could feel it reaching out, its intent pressing against me like a tidal wave. It wanted something from me, something I didn't understand, but couldn't refuse. The cracks in the ground widened, the light from the altar spilling into them like molten fire. The hum grew louder, more intense, and the air around me seemed to shimmer, bending and warping as though reality itself was unraveling. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. My throat burned, my lungs straining against the suffocating pressure. And then I saw it, a shape deep within the light, buried beneath the altar. It was faint at first, an outline that didn't make sense, its edges shifting and twisting as though it were alive. But as the light grew brighter, the shape became clearer, solidifying into something ancient and incomprehensible. It was vast, its form stretching beyond the limits of the altar, beyond the clearing, beyond the forest. It was everywhere and nowhere, its presence seeping into the air, into the ground, into me. The creature at the altar tilted its head, as if acknowledging the shape, its jagged form bowing slightly before stepping back. The thing beneath the altar moved. It wasn't a motion I could comprehend, more like the idea of movement, a shifting of reality itself. The cracks in the ground widened further, splitting the clearing into fragments, the light spilling out in violent bursts. The air grew colder, the pressure more intense, and I fell to my knees, my body trembling with the effort to stay upright. The whispers returned, louder now, their tone commanding, undeniable. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were in my head, threading through my thoughts, pulling me apart piece by piece. I clutched at my skull, trying to block them out, but it was useless. And you are chosen. The words sliced through the whispers, clear and deliberate, echoing in my mind like a bell tolling in the dark. The light from the altar surged, filling the clearing with a brilliance that burned against my skin. The cracks beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling into the void below. The descent was endless, the light above fading into a pinprick as the darkness swallowed me whole. The hum was everywhere now, a constant pulsing rhythm that matched the frantic beat of my heart. My body felt weightless, untethered, as though I had been stripped of everything that made me real. When I hit the ground, it wasn't earth beneath me. It was cold, smooth, and unyielding, stretching out in all directions like an endless plain. The air was thin, sharp against my lungs, and the whispers were deafening, a relentless chorus that filled the space around me. The figure was there. It stood over me, its form no longer flickering, no longer jagged. It was solid now, its limbs impossibly long, its presence overwhelming. The void of its face was closer, larger, consuming everything else. I tried to move, to crawl away, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure reached out, its hand hovering inches from my chest. The cold radiating from it was unbearable, sinking into me, freezing me from the inside out. The whispers reached a crescendo, the light behind the figure flaring one last time. You belong to us. Eerie, soon. The hand pressed against my chest, and the world fractured. The fracture wasn't just in the world around me. It was in me. My chest burned where the creature's hand had pressed against it, the sensation spreading outward like cracks in glass. I tried to breathe, but every inhale felt like I was drawing in shards of ice. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deep silence that felt heavier, denser, as though the air had turned to stone. I was still in the clearing, or at least what was left of it. The ground beneath me was fractured, glowing veins of light cutting through the dark soil like scars. The trees were distant shadows, blurred and bent, their forms twisting unnaturally, as though they couldn't fully exist here anymore. The altar was shattered, its jagged remains scattered across the ground, still pulsing faintly with that sickly light. And the creature was gone. I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling, the weight of the air pressing down on me like a physical force. The cracks beneath me radiated a faint warmth, but it wasn't comforting. It was a warning. The light spilling from them wasn't natural. It was alive, pulsing in time with the hum that still vibrated through the ground. The forest had changed. It wasn't just the clearing that was wrong. It was everything. The trees were taller, their branches stretching impossibly high, tangling with the black sky above. The air smelled sharp, metallic, like blood and ozone. My flashlight was gone. The faint glow from the cracks, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, my movements slow and unsteady. The ground shifted beneath me with every step, the cracks widening, their light flaring brighter as though the forest itself was reacting to my presence. My chest ached with every breath, the cold radiating outward, deeper into my body. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow shifting against the light. But as I turned, the shape resolved into something more. It wasn't the creature, not the one I'd seen before. This was something larger, more fragmented, its edges jagged and constantly shifting. It didn't move toward me, but it didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to freeze me in place. It wasn't watching me, it was inside me. The cold in my chest grew stronger, sharper, and I fell to my knees, clutching at the spot where the creature's hand had touched me. The cracks beneath me flared again, their light surging upward, illuminating the fragmented shape. For the first time, I understood what it was. It wasn't a creature. It was the forest. It was everything. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from my lungs. The whispers returned, faint and indistinct, threading through the silence like smoke. They weren't words. Not exactly, but they carried meaning, an intent that settled deep in my bones. You are one of us now. Envy, unechoed shooting. The light from the cracks pulsed brighter, almost blinding, and the cold in my chest reached its peak. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as the light consumed me, burning away everything else. My vision blurred, the clearing dissolving into a kaleidoscope of shapes and colors that didn't make sense. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The light faded, the hum quieted, and I was left kneeling in the clearing, the air still and suffocatingly silent. The cracks in the ground were gone, the altar reduced to nothing but ash. The trees stood still now, their twisted forms casting long shadows across the darkened earth. But I wasn't the same. The cold in my chest was gone, replaced by something else. Something warm, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. I could feel it moving through me, threading through my veins like a second heartbeat. My thoughts felt fractured, pieces of something larger, pressing against the edges of my mind, trying to force their way in. I stood slowly, my movements no longer my own. The forest felt different now, less like a place and more like a living thing, its presence pressing against me, welcoming me. I stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, the shadows parting as I moved. The whispers followed, softer now, their tone almost gentle. You are ours. I didn't fight it. I couldn't. The thing inside me, the thing that had been pressed into my chest, was part of me now. A thread that tied me to the forest, and whatever lived within it. I walked without direction, the shadows closing in behind me, erasing any trace of where I had been. The last thing I saw, before the darkness swallowed me completely, was the forest, stretching endlessly before me, alive and waiting. And I knew I would never leave.